the topic that I want to speak about today is the question of hakel. It's a as I mentioned to someone yesterday, it was a topic that I said that if I don't talk about it this year, I'm going to have to wait for another 7 years to really discuss it. And so, on the other hand, you can assume that I probably won't I won't revisit this topic for another 7 years or so. The question that I want to get to and discuss from a historical perspective is, should we be having the Zecher Lahakel ceremonies? Should we not be having those ceremonies? What are the pluses? What are the minuses of having them? But before we talk about that, I want to talk about the, if you will, hakel as it was, as it seems to be presented to us in the Torah, as well as the way that Chazal understood it in the Mishnah and the Gemara and elsewhere. And it's a mitzvah. I'll just begin by saying that it's a mitzvah. It's in the count of the Sefer HaChinuch. It's mitzvah 612. The last mitzvah is the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah. But this is the penultimate mitzvah of in the Torah, and it is separated from the section of Sefer Dvarim called the Ne'um HaMitzvot, the speech that Moshe gave, where there is a review as well as other new mitzvot that are introduced, and hundreds of mitzvot are dealt with. And then we have the Parsha that we read last week, Parshat Nitzavim, the covenant, and the it really began in Parshat Kitavo, the covenants that were made with Bnei Yisrael as they were waiting to enter Eretz Yisrael on the east bank of the Jordan, finishing in Parshat Nitzavim. And now we begin our Parsha with telling us that Moshe, it's his last day. Vayelech Moshe goes and calls the people, and within that context, we read it this morning as part of the reading for Monday and Thursday. We have the following: the Perek Lamed Aleph, Psukim Tet through Yud Gimel. There was the source at the top of the page. Vayichtov Moshe et Torah azot, vayitna lakohanim bnei Levi anesiim et Aaron Brit Hashem ve'kol ziknei Yisrael. So Moshe writes the Sefer Torah, and he gives it to the Kohanim. He gives it to the Hanosim, the ones who carry the Aaron Brit Hashem, and all of the elders. Vayitzav Moshe otam lemor, and once he has basically a complete Sefer Torah. We'll leave the question aside right now. What about the rest of the Torah that we are still going to read? What about the rest of Parshat Vayelach? What about Parshat Hazinu? What about Zot HaBracha? Leave that aside for the moment. The Torah seems to be complete in this storyline, and Moshe gives it to them and says, "Vayitzav Moshe otam leimor miked sheva shanim b'moed shnat hashmita b'chag haSukkot." Every 7 years at the end of the Shemitah year, even here you can see there's a little bit of a ambiguity. Does it mean the beginning of the Shemitah year, or is it the end of the Shemitah year? We say it's the end of the Shemitah year. Bevo kol Yisrael eiraot et pnei Hashem Elokecha b'makom asher yivchar. When Bnei Yisrael comes to the to be seen and to see God and the place that He chooses, Tikra the Torah azot neged kol Yisrael ba'oznehem. Read this Torah. Hakel ta'am, gather the Am, ha'anashim anashim v'hataf v'gercha asher bisharecha. So men, women, children, the stranger in your gates, leman yishma'u, leman yilmedu v'yiru et Hashem Elokechem v'shamru la'asot et kol divrei Torah hazot, and they should keep, hear and keep learn to fear God, to keep everything that's written in this Torah. Uvneihem asher lo yadu yishma'u v'lamdu liyirat Hashem Elokechem, and their children who do not know this, so they will learn, they will hear, and they will learn to keep this. Kol hayamim asher atem chayim al ha'adama asher atem rovim et hayarden shama l'rishta. That and they will fulfill this for all days in the other side of the Jordan, meaning the western side of the Jordan, our side of the Jordan, for as many years as you will live in that land. So that is the psukim. Now, if I ask now, why is this separated from the bulk of the mitzvot? Why is it in effect a summary mitzvah? So we can understand that very clearly. In other words, it's important that we have the Torah hazot. Until this point, the Torah isn't complete. And this might also answer my question that I said, well, leave aside this question, the question of, well, what about ha'azinu? What about zot habracha? If the Torah that Moshe is referring to here means the halachic, the legal aspects of the Torah, so now it's complete. There are really, if you think about it, 611 mitzvot, not under 613. The 611 mitzvot are those mitzvot that you're supposed to do on a regular basis, or on a semi-regular basis, or an occasional basis, but you're supposed to fulfill certain mitzvot. They are specific details that touch upon every aspect of life. The last two mitzvot, this and writing the Sefer Torah, are mitzvot that are, once I have the 611, how do I continue to transmit the 611? So one way of transmitting the 611 is by making sure that the Sefer Torah is written, and that's where you get the mitzvah for writing a Sefer Torah. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is by transmitting it in a public fashion, and the Torah says that public fashion, that public transmission, should be done every 7 years, Chag HaSukkot. But what are we transmitting? We're transmitting what is written previously, the other 611, as it were. And so the simplest way of understanding this is basically what the Torah itself is telling us, is, if you read it on a straightforward level, is the purpose of Vahakel is to aid that transmission. And this is exactly what the first source, the Sforno, the source number 1, says, Leman Yishmu'u. So in order to hear, so here, the idea of hearing isn't to actually to hear the words he says, but rather it is Yavinu Chachmei Am. So the Chachamim will understand. So it's the idea of hearing. There is no. This is something that Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, pointed out on several occasions. There is no biblical word for paying attention. As such, to listen and to really pay attention. We'll say to lahakshiv in modern Hebrew. That's something that developed later on. But in the Torah, you don't have that word. So the word Shema has multiple meanings, and one of the meanings is to understand. And that is what the way the Sforno understands it here. Leman Yishmu, in order that the Chachamim will understand it. Uleman Yilmedu. So Yilmedu means Yilmedu Mehem Habilti Mevinim. So the people who are the Chachamim have the responsibility to to learn it in depth and to understand the principles, and then they can transmit it and teach it, Laman Yilmidu, to those people who don't have that deeper understanding. Uvneihem asher lo yadu, and the bneihem asher lo yadu. What does that mean? Shelo hayu yodim lishol biotam taf. Well, in Pasuk Yud Bet, we have here. There's a distinction being drawn between the taf and the bneihem. Taf are children of every age, and the children of every age are people who are including those children who are too young to even know what they are doing there, whereas B'neihem is an older child, and they yishma'u shmiyat ha'ozen or yishma'u shenemru dvarim ba. In other words, the B'neihem, the next generation, will have remembered, hopefully, when they were infants, or they may not remember it, but they will know that they were brought to the Hakel ceremony when they were toddlers. But now older children will begin the learning process. That's the way that the Sforno says, and it really fits in very nicely with the Pshuto Shel Mikra. There is a Gemara in Chagiga, and it's found elsewhere, where the Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah is quoted. There's a larger story context to it, which we won't get into right now. Rabbi Yoshua asked the Shabbat Shel Mi Haitam, now looking at source number 2, the Bavli in Chagiga. The Rabbi Yoshua asked his students, whose week was it as the Nasi in the Rosh Yeshiva of the Sanhedrin? And he was told that it was Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah. And he asked what were they learning, and the answer was in the Mitzvah of Hakel. Uma darashba, what drasha was made? Hakel et ha'am v'hanashim v'hataf. So bringing all Jews of every age, and the question that Rebbe Lezer ben Azariah posed, im hanashim ba'im lilmod, nashim ba'ot lishmoa. So slightly different than what the Sforno said. But basically, the men who have the mitzvah of limud Torah, so they're learning the mitzvah. The women hear and understand what they're supposed to do. Perhaps they're not engaged actively in Talmud Torah. Not that it would be asur for them to be engaged in it, but that might not be the primary purpose for them being there. Taf, lama ba'in. What's the purpose of having the taf there, and specifically the taf, as opposed to older children? And I'm not going to read it inside, but that's the third source. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman in his Perush makes that distinction, which we already saw in the Sforno. So what's the purpose of the taf? Kedei liten skar l'miviehem, in order to give reward for those people who bring him. Now this doesn't really work if you think about it, because after all, the Torah tells us why the children should be there. The children should be there in order to Lemanya Vishamu Yishbu Vilamdu Pasuk Yugimel. They're going to hear it and they're going to learn. So that's why I bring the taf. But based on this Sforno, based on what how Rav David Tzvi Hoffman learns the psukim as well, and based on this Gemara, you can understand it. Basically, the taf are those children who are too young to have any educational impact upon them whatsoever. Maybe even too young to have educational impact on them even as an experience. In other words, you can talk about the experience, let's say, of the Seder that a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old has, even if they're not necessarily able to absorb the primary messages of the Seder. But the experience of the Seder is something that very young children can appreciate. However, a 2-year-old or even younger, an 18-month-old, they're not going to have any appreciation whatsoever. No experience is going to register. So why bring them? They're just the kids making noise in shul. Why bring them? So the answer is that basically what it's saying is that it's making a statement on the part of the community and the family that everyone belongs here. And because everyone belongs here, that is why even those people who don't necessarily have any educational message that's being absorbed by them, they also come. There's actually an interesting halachic question that's raised, and this is perhaps the difference between this and other mitzvot of chinuch. The idea of chinuch is that we are training the child to be able to participate as a full adult in the future. If you have here you're dealing with people who are not yet of the age of chinuch, so the training part isn't there. So therefore, but yet you still have to bring them. It would follow that even people who, you might not have a mitzvah of chinuch in that sense, also have to be brought. And so this is the idea that that we get of it. However, there's an opening here that still needs to be asked. Why? What's the sachar l'mivayehen? What value is there in the person coming, if the child, if they're not learning anything anyway? So I get it that it's not for the child, it's for the parents. But why are the parents receiving any reward by bringing someone who is not absorbing any of the message or the experience that's going on around them? So this might lead me to a different way of looking at it. I'm going to skip number 4 for the moment. Maybe I'll come back to it. And I'm going to look at number 5. And number 5 is the Rambam in Hilchot Chagiga. The Rambam in the 3rd parak of Hilchot Chagiga goes through the details of the Hakel ceremony. And here the Rambam makes the following, he says the following chidush, and it's not so clear where the Rambam got it from. And we're going to try to answer that in just one moment, but this is what the Rambam says. The Rambam says that everyone needs to come, and that's from the Psukim. But he says the following: Gerim she'enan makirin chayavim lahachin lachem ulahakshiv oznam lishmoa be'ema v'yira v'gila bira'ada. So he's mentioned the other people before in the previous halachot, and now he talks about the stranger. And here the stranger is referring not to a ger tzedek, it's referring to what we would call a ger toshav. And it's referring to people who are not only not Jews by birth, but are not halachically Jewish. They also should be in the Hakel ceremony. And the way that he says is because to prepare themselves to listen. Here already the word lahakshiv had already entered into Hebrew at this point, to listen with fear and with awe, gila bira'ada, with the trembling of joy. Interesting phrases that the Rambam used. And then the Rambam says the following, and here what's in the bold: Kiyom shenitna bo misinai. As though this is the day that the Torah was given from Sinai. Now, where does that come from? What's this idea that the Rambam is trying to get at, that this is a reenactment of Sinai? That doesn't come from the Psukim. That does not come from the Gemara. And the Rambam doubles down with this by continuing. It says, "Afilu chachamim gdolim sheyodin kol haTorah kula." So even great chachamim who already know the entire Torah, chayavin lishmoa b'chavana gdola yetera. So they too have to listen with great attention to what is being read. ומי שאינו יכול לשמוע מכוון ליבו לקריאה זו, שלא קבע הכתוב אלא לחזק דעת האמת, because this is only being given in order to fortify the true religion. V'yireh atzmo, and now the last line, which is in bold, ki'ilu ata nitztaveh ba umipi hagvura shomat shahamelach shaliachu lahashmiya divrei ha'el. But so now it should be as though it was given at this moment from God Himself, because the Melech, and we have to now talk about, we'll get to that in about 10 minutes time, but the question of who should be reading this. So the Rambam is assuming that it's the king, and that's based on Chazal's understanding of it, which we'll see. But the idea that the Hakel is a reenactment of Sinai, this is something that the Rambam made up, or maybe not. Maybe he has the source, but it's not found in any of the sources that the classic rabbinic sources that predates the Rambam. So the question is, where did the Rambam get it from? This question here in source number 6. So I took this from an article written by I don't know who he was, but Alexander Malkiel. I actually saw this quoted in a different article by Rav Samet on the issue of Hakel, and this is this was published, as you can see, in 1966, Tafshin Chavav, and in that article, he describes a lecture, a public lecture, that the first Rav Harashi of Medinat Israel, Rav Herzog Zatzal. So before the actual establishment of the state, this was in 1945. In 1945, it was post Shemitah. And Rav Herzog, and we'll talk more about the history of this in a moment, Rav Herzog was of the opinion that we should try to reestablish the din of Hakel. And in a public lecture that he gave about Hakel, so he was speaking with about the mitzvah in general, and he raised the question with regard to the Rambam, and he said that that he thinks that the idea of Hakel was the idea that the Rambam came up with was based on a parallel that can be found in the Psukim. If you take a look at number 7, so there I put a little table, which and the table is taken from Rav Samet's article on Hakel, but the idea is already mentioned by Rav Herzog in that lecture, that there is another pasuk. The other pasuk is in back in Parshat Ve'et Chanan, and the in Ve'et Chanan, the Torah says, and this is when Moshe Rabbeinu is reviewing what happened in Har Sinai. It leads up to the second the retelling of the Aseret HaDibrot in Parshat Ve'etchanan. It's Mamad Har Sinai, Mamad Har Chorev. And God says the following, or Moshe says, quoting God, Hakel li et ha'am, va'ashmiem et dvarai, asher yilmidun liyira'oti, kol hayamim asher ha'im chayim al ha'adama, ve'et b'neihem yilamedun. So if you take a look at that pasuk, right? Gather for me the people. We're not talking about Sukkot. We're not talking about in Yerushalayim. We're talking about at Sinai. Gather for me the people, and I will make known my words that I will teach, that they will learn, excuse me, in order to fear me all of the days that they are alive on this earth. Ve'et b'neihem yilmedun, and they will teach, or yilamedun, excuse me, they will teach their children. That is almost word for word parallel to what the Torah describes in Hakel 27 prakim later in Sefer at the end of Sefer Dvarim in our Parsha. Here it's Hakel et ha'am leman yishma'u. Right, you could look at the full text at the top of the page, but I'm just in the table. I'm just working with the parallels. And here there's a flip, because now in the original, meaning at Sinai, it's they will fear, right? First, they will have this for all of the time that they are on the planet, and they will, or on the land, and they will teach their children. That's what it is at the end. But but here the way that it's being presented is that because in Hakel, meaning our Hakel, every 7 years, the primary emphasis is to recreate Sinai in order that it be able to be passed on. That experience is able to be passed on from one generation to the next. So therefore, it's v'neihem yishma'u v'lamdu liyira and kol hayamim. So the flip is because of the way that it's being the focus of the focus of the educational aspect. As opposed to the original experience at Sinai. But you see clearly, Rav Herzog said, where the Rambam got it from. The Rambam got it from the fact that the Torah is drawing this parallel between the Ma'amad Har Sinai and the Ma'amad of Hakel, the Hakel ceremony that takes place every 7 years. It is a recreation. It's designed to be a recreation of this idea can explain now, if I go back to the Gemara, why do I have to bring the taf? Why do I have to bring the children? The children who are too young to fall within the category of Yishma'u v'lamdu liyira, the children who cannot yet hear, they cannot yet learn, they cannot yet fear. Why bring them? And the answer is because they were at Har Sinai too. Every Jew was at Har Sinai, and also every Ger was at Sinai. The Erev Rav were also at Sinai. So anyone who's associated with Am Yisrael was at Sinai. That's what Ma'amar, that's what Revelation was all about. Similarly, at the recreation of the Revelation that we have in Yerushalayim, so we make sure that every possible person is there as well. Rav Soloveitchik also independently came up with a very similar idea. In his, I don't know when he gave this particular shiur, but in the shiur L'Zecher Abba Mari, in the Yortzeit shiurim that he gave for his father who passed away in 1940. So in one of those years, he was discussing the idea of Kriyat Torah in general. So he's talked about the idea of Hakel. And he said that within the context of Hakel, in a very good Brisker fashion, Mivuar ki yesh shnei kiyumim b'mitzvat hakel. There are two separate aspects, halachic formulations and halachic fulfillments that occur in hakel. Aleph, lilmod. So one of them is to learn. The idea is to understand. Bet, lishmoa. The second is to hear. Afilu im adam eino mevin. So even if a person doesn't understand, in other words, here we're again, he's not necessarily disagreeing with the Sforno that we saw in the beginning of the Shir. The Sforno who translated lishmoa as lehavin. The Rav Soloveitchik is saying maybe that would be the first lishmoa, maybe, but afterwards you have another lishmoa which isn't being used to talk about understanding. Again, he might disagree with the Sforno. I don't know, but but certainly the second lishmoa, he would say, is not to be understood as understanding. Afilu im adam eino mevin. Even if a person doesn't understand, to hear. V'nireh kishrei kiyumim elu chashuvim lo rak b'nogea lemitzvat hakel ki im biyachas lemitzvat talmud Torah ukriyata bichlal. As I said, the shir was about kriyat Torah. So he said the same way that you have this idea in hakel, you have it when you approach Torah, and he explains that when you're talking about Torah sheba'al peh, if you're engaged in the learning of Torah sheba'al peh, so there the overwhelming weight is on the side of the learning and understanding. That's why we're doing what we're doing right now, as I'm teaching this shir, is to get a better understanding of the din in order to be able to apply it better. But there is also a notion of of kriyah b'Torah. Not limod, but bet of hashma'at divrei Hashem v'tzibur, to make sure that God's word is heard in a public forum. Shehi mitzvah miyuchedet b'fnei atzma, asher mikora parshat ve'et chanan. And he says, where does that come from? Those very same psukim that we just learned from Parshat ve'et chanan. Namely, hakel li et ha'am v'ashmiyem et dvarai asher yilmedu li'irauti kol ha'yamim shem chayim al ha'adama ve'et b'neihem yilamedun. So this is the main mitzvah kshura b'torah shebichtav. Where is the emphasis of the Torah shebichtav? After all, you read the Torah and you read the pasuk of ayin tachat ayin, right? An eye for an eye. And we all understand that that's not what ayin, that's not what the halacha is. We don't take an eye for an eye. Why do we read it? So the answer is that the Torah shebichtav so it's not just that I'm sitting and learning, I'm saying, okay, here's the source in the Torah, and now I go from there to the understanding of the Torah sheba'al peh. No, that's not what's going on. What I'm doing is when I'm reading the Torah, I'm having an experience of just standing and hearing God's word without understanding it. You don't have time when the Baal Koreh reads the pasuk and says l'totafot bein einecha, to understand the various halachot of tefillin, or for that matter, if I say shamoret yom haShabbat lekodsho, what does it mean to keep Shabbat? And you don't get into, while you're hearing it, if you start thinking about the 39 malachot, well, you've missed the next pasuk. It's an aspect which is not focusing on the understanding of the text; it's focusing on the revelatory nature of the text. That the very fact that I am reading God's word has importance in of itself. So the Soloveitchik is saying that I get that in Hakel, but really, I get it from every time that I'm learning. That's the idea of the Torah. He expands on the theme in the next source number 9, in his piece of Uvikashtem Misham, and he says that basically, when we read the Torah every week, when we read the Torah, we are engaged in both of these aspects, both the learning, but primarily the idea of revelation. And he gives a couple of, I won't read it inside, but I'll just point out the areas of Talmud Torah, or the areas of Kriyat Torah where this comes to fore. So, for example, when we read the Aseret HaDibrot, we read the so there are times that there are the trop, the Tamei HaMikra are known. There are two different Tamei HaMikra which tradition has given us for the Aseret HaDibrot, both in Parshat Yitro, in Sefer Shemot, as well as the second reading of the Aseret HaDibrot in Parshat Ve'etchanan in Sefer Dvarim. And the reading of the Aseret HaDibrot, so if you read it with what's known as Tam Elyon divides the Aseret Dibrot not based on the psukim, but based on each of the Aseret HaDibrot. Whether they are long or they're short, they are read as though it is, you read all of Shabbat as though it were, even though it's 4 psukim, you read it maybe 5, it's forgetting whether it's 4 or 5, but anyway, you read those psukim as though they're one pasuk. Similarly, you read a fragment of a pasuk, lo tirtzach, right? Do not murder. You read that as a full pasuk, because what we're focusing on is not the learning. He says if you're learning something, you're learning it pasuk by pasuk. But if you are talking about the idea, the concept of Shabbat, as it was given to us at Sinai, so then you read all of it as though it's one flow. Lo tirtzach, one separate idea. So that's why there are different minhagim. Many communities have different minhagim here, but there are those communities that when they read it on Shavuot, they read it with the Tam Elyon. And when they read it during the year in Parshat Yitro, they read it with the Tam Tachton, because on Shavuot, we're focusing on the revelation, but on the rest of the year, the primary focus is on the content, not on the experience. Other communities read it with the Tam Elyon always, and that's why you have the Tam Elyon for the Aseret HaDibrot in Parshat Ve'etchanan, even though they're only read as during the course of the year. They're never read at any other time. Okay. So I'm having now my computer finally got it. Okay, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm glad that I started with I started on just using the audio. Again, my computer was not very cooperative today. But now getting back to the Makorot, and
I can even see you now.
You can even see me now. Yes. So so if I get back to the Makorot now, and I'll try to get them onto the screen as well. That'll take another minute or so. But in any event, if I'm back with Rav Soloveitchik, so he basically says that Hakel is we in effect fulfill Hakel every time we read the Torah. And another aspect that he mentions is the minhag to stand during Kriyat Torah, so we can understand where that minhag comes from. The minhag of those people who stand during Kriyat Torah are in effect recreating Sinai every time that they read from the Torah, because and just as at Sinai we were all standing at the foot of the mountain, so similarly that minhag is developed to stand during Kriyat Torah. Now, if I now go from just to recap, there are two primary reasons that we can look at for the mitzvah of Hakel. We can look at the mitzvah of Hakel for the idea of transmitting the content of the Torah, and that, I guess you could say, is the simplest reading of the text. L'man yishma'u, l'man yilmidun, etc. You can also look at Hakel as being an experience of recreating Ma'amad Har Sinai, and that is the two aspects don't necessarily contradict one another, of course, and that's but that becomes the rationale for Hakel, and so those two different aspects come up, and that's it's very interesting that both Rav Soloveitchik as well as Rav Herzog, and they're basically contemporaries of one another, that they Rav Herzog being slightly older, that they both came up with the same idea based on the chidush, if you will, of the Rambam, and based on the same psukim. Having said that, if you will, is a bit of a introduction to the Hakel, and really gets to the heart of the mitzvah. The way that the Mishnah presents Hakel is interesting in its own right. The Mishnah, if you take a look at source number 10, the Mishnah says, this is a Mishnah at the end of the seventh parak of Sotah. The Mishnah says that I'm going to try to share the screen now so we can the host please allow me to share the screen? Thank you. Anyway, the Mishnah calls it Parshat Hamelach.
We have
Parshat. Do you see it now? You should see it now.
Yeah, it's there.
Okay.
Although it's small.
It's small. So, second. So the okay. Should have stuck with the text. Share screen as process. All right. No, it's not working. I'm going to get back to working with the text. So the Torah the Mishnah says it's the following: Parshat Hamelach Ketzad. What is the Parshat Hamelach? Mitzvah Hakel
is called by the Parsha of the king. Because the Mishnah continues and explains, Motzei Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag B'Shmini B'Motzei Shvi'it Osid Lo Bima Shel Eitz Ba'azara. So on the night of the first day, meaning on Motzei Chag, the second night of Sukkot, in the 8th year after the Shvi'it, so they would make a platform, Bima Shel Eitz Ba'azara, in a platform of wood that was in the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash. V'hu yoshev aleha, and he would sit on that platform. Shene'amar, and we have the psukim miket shavashanim b'moed, etc. V'gomer, excuse me. Chazan HaKnesset. So the Gabai of the Knesset, of the Beit Knesset that was on the mount, and we're going to hear about him also in the Mishnah of Yoma with regard to the Avodah of Yom Kippurim. But he takes, they'll tell Sefer Torah, v'notneh l'rosh HaKnesset, v'rosh HaKnesset notneh l'sagan, v'hasagan notneh l'kohen gadol, v'kohen gadol notneh l'melech, v'hamelech omed u'mekabel v'koreh v'yoshev. So basically, what happens? There is a procession that occurs. The Sefer Torah is taken out of the Aron Kodesh by a relatively junior official and he gives it to the person who's in charge of the running of the Beit Knesset in the Beit HaMikdash, the Torah reading, and that person gives it to the vice Kohen, as it were, the vice Kohen Gadol, the person who would stand in for the Kohen Gadol for whatever the reason he's unable to fulfill his discharge his duties. He gives it to the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen gives it to the Melech. What you're seeing here is a progression, but it's also seeing in effect a subordination, if you will, of the spiritual authority of the Kohen Gadol, building up to the authority of the Melech, which isn't a spiritual authority, it's a temporal authority. And it's important for the Melech to be reading it. Now, the question has to be asked, and I'll ask it, where do we get the idea that the king reads it? Where in the psukim is it mentioned that the king is the person who is reading Parshat Hakel? There is no mention of it at all. It says just Tikra, you shall read. Why should it be the king per se? Leave that question in the air for a moment, and we'll finish the Mishnah. Back to the second paragraph of the Mishnah. Agrippas Hamelech Amad v'kibel v'kara omed. So Agrippas, even though he was allowed to read it sitting down because there's the idea of the kavod of the Melech, he read it standing up. V'shavchu chachamim, and the chachamim praised him. Agrippa the Melech was Herod Agrippa. He lived in the middle of the 1st century CE, about 30 years or so before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. His mother was Bernice, was her name, was not considered to be halachically Jewish, and whether he himself had undergone a gerut or she underwent a gerut, but as a result, the following pasuk that he had to read, this is part of the reading for Hakel. Ukshihigia lo tuchal latet alecha ish nachri. So when he reached the pasuk with regard to the Melech, that you're not allowed to have a foreigner be the king over you, zalgu einav d'ma'ot. So he started to cry. Amrulo, Al tityare Agrippas. Don't be afraid, Agrippas. Achinu ata, achinu ata, achinu ata. You're our brother. You're our brother. And then, so that's an aside in the Mishnah, and then gets into the what is he supposed to read, and we're told different sections of Sefer Devarim, which is read, including the Parsha of the Melech. The idea, though, that you get from here, and we have to get back to the question of what's the source for the Melech doing it. I haven't forgotten that question, but is that and you see it very clearly from Agrippa's, and maybe that's why this story is brought here, is that the Melech, on the one hand, you get a sense of the subordination of what I said, the spiritual authority of the Kohen Gadol to the temporal authority of the Melech. On the other hand, the actual reading of the text is supposed to subordinate the temporal authority to the spiritual demands of the Torah. Whereas it could be that the Melech, as in terms of his position, the executive, has more authority than the spiritual authority of the Kohen Gadol. That might be. But the Melech has to answer to Melech Malchei HaMelachim. And the Melech Malchei HaMelachim gets his point across through the Torah. So the fact that the Melech is reading it is so that the Melech himself subordinates himself to the spiritual authority of the Torah. And you see that very clearly in the story of Agrippas. He reads the pasuk and he realizes that there's something wrong. The Chachamim in the Gemara and the Rishonim are castigated for telling him achinu ata, achinu ata, achinu ata, that they had an opportunity to be working with Agrippas on this score, and they squandered it by allowing him to think that everything was okay, instead of working with him, whatever halachic solution or lack thereof would have existed. That perhaps is what they should have done. But the fact that you see that Agrippas is impacted by what he reads, and the Mishnah feels that it's important for us to know that in that reading, sometime in the middle of the first century, a few decades before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, that Agrippas was impacted. So it's telling us what the purpose of or one of the major purposes of the Kriya is as well. And here we have, if you will, three different purposes. You have the idea that everyone learns the Torah. That was purpose number one. You have the idea of the reenactment of Sinai. That's the Rambam, as we explained through looking at the parallel in the Psukim and the way that Rav Herzog and Rav Soloveitchik understood it. And here you have a third aspect, which is to make sure, or to try to make sure, that the authorities, that the executive branch, and presumably the Kohen Gadol as well, that everyone is submitting themselves to the ultimate authority of the Torah. And so that is obviously connected to the other two reasons, because the Moshe Rabbeinu was at Sinai too. But the idea that this is something which is, there's a focus on the Melech, so that's something which is very important. Where do we get the idea that the Melech should be reading? It's a nice idea that this is giving him that authority, but where is the Melech getting this from at all? So here, I'm taking this now, source number 11, the Bechor Shor, was a medieval commentary on the Torah, one of the Balei Tosfot. So he says the following: because the pasuk says what's in bold in number 11, Tikra et HaTorah, liYehoshua haya mitzaveh. So who did Moshe speak to in the second person singular? Tikra et HaTorah. So it's saying that the Moshe is not addressing the Jewish people. Hakel ta'am, it's referring to you. Yehoshua have the responsibility hakel ta'am and to read the Torah, and this is lakach, and therefore hamelech koreh oto, and that's why the king, that's where the idea that it's the king's mitzvah begins, because Yehoshua, Moshe has a din of a melech. Yehoshua, who's his successor, has a din of a melech. Quite possibly, you can say that the shoftim have that din of a melech. Now is not the time to get into it, but Rav Kook has a very interesting piece. Rav Kook basically says that whatever authority the Jewish people have or give to a person or to a group of people, they have a din of melech. That's very important, and we've touched upon that, Rav Kook, in the past when we were talking about the halachic authority of the government of the state of Israel. So according to Rav Kook, any government of a Jewish state has a din of melech. So by extension, you could say that the leaders of the country, even if, remember, there will only be a formal melech about 400 years later when Shaul is appointed king. Till then, there is no melech. Was there a hakel before then? Quite possibly. Might have been a hakel at Shiloh. Shiloh was a makom asher yivchar Hashem. We don't have any. There is no mention, explicit mention of hakel in Tanakh as being fulfilled. You can perhaps find hints to it. Now I don't have time to get into that, but there you can find some hints to this, but there isn't any mention of a hakel ceremony taking place. So, but does that mean it didn't take place? There were a lot of mitzvot that presumably took place, but aren't mentioned explicitly in Nevi'im and Ketuvim as having taken place. So this is would fall into that category. But this is where it comes from the Melech, the idea. So now why should it be the king? So I gave one reason, right? Namely that the king should realize that he also has the authority. When you have the mitzvah, by the way, of writing a Sefer Torah, so the mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah, before we get the general mitzvah of writing the Sefer Torah, which is, as I said, the last mitzvah in the Torah, the king has a explicit mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah that was taught back in Parshat Shoftim, presumably for this very reason, that the king, that not presumably, the Torah says explicitly that that's the reason, that the king should realize that his authority stems from the Ribono Shel Olam, stems from the Torah. So here you have another way of saying it. However, the Bechor Shor gives a different reason. His reason is that the Sheyeh Mefaresh Umitargem Oto Ba'er Hetev. Well, it's basically, he's saying that people pay attention to the king. If it was the Kohen Gadol getting up, and other Mefarshim say this more explicitly, if it was the Kohen Gadol getting up and reading it, so that would be nice. But I expect the Kohen Gadol, I expect the rabbi to be giving a drasha. But when it is the supreme legal executive authority that is reading the Torah, that has more impact on the listeners. So it has more impact on the reader, on the melech, and it has more impact on the listeners as well. Having said that, what if there isn't a king? So if you skip down, we'll hopefully come back to number 13, but if you take a look at number 14, the Hamek Davar, the Nitziv, in his Perush, so, and others say this as well, the Minchat Chinuch, for example, says this as well, it says, what happens if there's no king? Do you have a hakel? Again, we can apply that question today. We still have to reach the question of today in the next few minutes, but we also have to talk about, well, historically speaking, leading up to Shaul, leading up to David, leading up to the king, leading up to Agrippas, is there a mitzvah for someone to be able to someone else to read it? So here, source number 14, the Nitziv says, Amnam lav dafka melech mamash, in the bold. It's not necessarily a king. Ella hagadol should be Yisrael. Whoever it is, it has to be a person who is recognized as the leader of Israel. Uvisha shelo hayta melucha haya gadol kohen gadol. When there wasn't the king, so the that person was the Kohen Gadol. We see this, by the way, in Josephus. Josephus talks about Hakel, and he says that, and he presumably witnessed it in the Beit HaMikdash, and he says, then when the multitude are assembled together onto the holy city for sacrificing every 7th year at the Feast of the Tabernacles, let the high priest stand upon a high desk whence he be heard, and let him read the laws to all the people. So the Kohen Gadol read it. And that's now, can we rely on Josephus? We can argue that maybe Josephus is writing this post facto and maybe he doesn't remember it clearly. You can argue that he's writing it for his Roman audience and he doesn't want to talk about a Jewish king. That's possible. But since he's not afraid of talking about Jewish kings otherwise, in terms of the descendants of the Hashmonaim, etc., so it could very well be that Josephus's own recollection stems from a time after Agrippus, immediately before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, where you didn't have a authority in when Judea is being governed by the Roman governor and without even a puppet king. And so at that point in time, the person who was reading it was the Kohen Gadol, and that's what he reports. And he gives the answer that the reason for this is along the lines of the Sforno, so that everyone hears it, everyone knows what the Torah is, the young children hear it, and in order to, just the last line, will be the cause of their future felicity, right? Their future adherence to the Torah will be because of their remembering, or partially because of their remembering of this particular mitzvah. Now, basically, from the time of the Churban on, we have no record of there being another Hakel, which is an interesting question. Namely, why wasn't there some ceremony that existed? You could have also have there are many mitzvot that we have, and this is the time of year where we do some of them, where we do Zecher LeMikdash. So, for example, we're going to be shaking the Arba Minim throughout the week of Sukkot, even though the mitzvah outside of the Beit HaMikdash is only on the first day of Sukkot. The rest of the week, there's no mitzvah to be shaking the lulav. Why are we going to shake the lulav? So the Gemara tells us, it's a Takana of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, after the destruction, Zecher LeMikdash. This is the way they would, this is the way that they did it in the Beit HaMikdash. So we do it as a remembrance for that. We don't see that when it comes, and there are other mitzvot like that. Why is Hakel not included in that list? We don't have any record of it. So first of all, is there a mitzvah of Hakel? So if going back to the psukim, we'll first look in the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch says mitzvah tafresh yud bet that noheget mitzvah zo bizman she Yisrael alad batam. The mitzvah only applies when the Jewish people is found on its land. And so from the time of the Churban, the majority of the Jewish people were not in Eretz Yisrael. This raises an interesting halachic question, which Be'ezrat Hashem will have to deal with this quandary in some way, manner, shape, or form. Obviously, ideally, we'll deal with it after Mashiach has arrived and there won't be much of a quandary. But we can ask the question even before Mashiach arrives, within the next decade, 20 years, if the current demographic trends continue, Be'ezrat Hashem, majority of the Jewish people will be found in Eretz Yisrael. The census data released has over 7 million Jews who are living currently in the state of Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, and estimates are that there are roughly between 15 and 16 million Jews in the world. So, and with current population growth, Be'ezrat Hashem, within the next few decades, we will pass the 50% mark here. So will there be a mitzvah d'oraita of hakel at that point? Another aspect is the Shemitah. There are those who say that since Shemitah doesn't apply d'oraita bisman hazeh, and since hakel is connected to the Shemitah, so therefore there is no mitzvah of hakel min haTorah today. The same question is going to be raised with regard to Shemitah. Once a majority of the Jewish people live in Eretz Yisrael, there are opinions that say that Shemitah should be a Torah din as well. So hold on to your halachic seats. We're going to be dealing with these questions, Be'ezrat Hashem, within the next 10 to 20 years, that we'll be having to ask, well, are these mitzvot, which are either d'Rabbanan in the case of Shemitah or non-existent in the case of Hakel, does that apply? Now, why does Hakel get the mitzvah of a rabbinic status, the same way that Shemitah did? So presumably, the reason is because unfortunately there wasn't sovereignty in the land. This is what's raised by the Achronim who talk about it. There wasn't Jewish sovereignty. If you have a mass gathering of people who are there to hear the Torah reading, and especially under Byzantine rule and Christian rule, so that Jews weren't even allowed to, the Har HaBayit laid in ruins until the mosques were built on it, because that was a sign from a Christian perspective that there had been a New Testament given. So certainly to have a ceremony celebrating the Old Testament, celebrating the Torah and Matan Torah, so that would not have been possible under Christian rule. Other people, that's what Rav Herzog wanted to argue. Other people question that. However, that seems pretty reasonable, that just because it's a public mitzvah that was done en masse once every 7 years with a very clear specific purpose, which went against went against the very essence of Christian doctrine. So that didn't allow for Hakel to gain any momentum as on a rabbinic level, and possibly that's why there wasn't even a zecher lahakel, the way that we find a zecher l'machatzit hashekel. In the modern era, this begins to change. Already, well before the establishment of the state, if we now take a look at source number 17, the Rabbi Eliyahu David Rabinovich Ta'omim, known as the Aderet, who was the father-in-law. He was the Rav in Panovich. He then made Aliyah and became the Rav of Yerushalayim. He was also the father-in-law of Rav Kook and the grandfather of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook. So he already, while he was in Europe, he released it was published anonymously, but he released a kuntrus, which he called Zecher L'Mikdash, and he talked about all sorts of dinim that he felt should be established in order to remember the Beit HaMikdash. And one of those dinim, he said, was Hakel. We in Chutz La'aretz, he was saying, we should have Hakel celebrations or ceremonies to remember the Hakel that was done in the Beit HaMikdash. He writes himself in his own autobiography a few years later, and that's the source 17b, that he in his sukkah had a reading in order to commemorate Hakel. And when he made Aliyah in the first decade of the 20th century, he tried to have it established. He ran into some problems both with the Jewish community as well as with the authorities, so it didn't happen. It's interesting that basically Rav Kook, when he was the chief rabbi, did not try to move this idea forward. After Rav Kook's death, it was claimed that Rav Kook had attempted to do so, but there were technical hurdles that could not be overcome. There is no, to the best of my knowledge, no historical documentation of the period, nothing in his writings or anything along those lines that would indicate that that's the truth. And it could very well be that it was happened post facto, that that people wanted to put that position in, ascribe that position to Rav Kook, and it would make sense because, after all, his father-in-law was the major proponent of doing it, but we don't have any record of it for Rav Kook. It does come up for the first time in, really, it comes up one time before, already in 1938, where Rav Uziel calls for, who was at that point the Rishon LeZion, the first Sephardic chief rabbi. He was served together both with Rav Kook and then later with Rav Herzog. This is after Rav Kook had passed away in 1938. And Rav Uziel, I didn't put this on the sheet, has a letter where he tries to, where he recommends that there be a Hakel celebration. It didn't happen then in 1938. It was actually, it was 1938. The 1 year before the outbreak of World War II. But that was also during the time when you have the Arab riots from 1936 to 1939, and that could explain why it wasn't possible to have a Hakel. However, in 1945, and this is after, right? This is immediately after the war is over. The war finishes it's still raging, actually. It hasn't quite finished in the Pacific. And yet Rav Herzog and Rav Uziel together come out with a letter. This is the source number 18, where they call for a Hakel celebration, and it happens. This is the last Hakel celebration at the Kotel. They have a Hakel celebration in 1945 at the Kotel, and it will be the last celebration at the Kotel until 1980. There was one that was scheduled for 1973, but that happened, the Yom Kippur War broke out a few days before, so the Hakel celebration and everything else that was going on in Sukkot were canceled. The next Shmita in 1980, there was a Hakel celebration, but already there was a letter. Now, here you have what I would call an ideological divide. Who are the people who are pushing it? And you also see who are the people who are participating in it. The chief rabbis are participating in it. The chief rabbis are calling for it. Various major halachic figures, whether it's Rav Herzog, Rav Uziel, Rav Unterman, who succeeded Rav Herzog, Rav Goren on the Sephardi side, Rav Avadia is involved as well as the earlier Rishonim Tzion and post. They're involved in having celebrations, but generally speaking, for example, in 1953, there is more than 10,000 people participate in a Hakel celebration here in Yerushalayim, but of course, Yerushalayim is divided and they can't go to the old city. So they have it first on Har Zion, and they go from Har Zion to a stadium in Katamon, and they have the celebration. The Haredi Rabbanim do not participate. When the Chazon Ish received a volume that was published by Mossad Rav Kook, that Rav Herzog was a primary contributor to, and it included the original article of Rav Kook's father-in-law, the Aderet. All of that's there. The story goes that the Chazon Ish responded in 3 words that he wrote on the cover of the Choveret, right? And the 3 words were very simply, right? Ein linhog kach. This should not be done. The Haredi world was basically opposed to it. There are stories about, they didn't come out with it publicly, and Chazon Ish didn't write a tshuva about it, but they didn't participate. And in other words, it was viewed, if you will, on a 4th level. Right? They talked about what's the purpose of Hakel. So the idea of teaching Torah is one level. The next level is the question of a Mamad Har Sinai, the idea of subordinating the executive authority of the Melech to the Torah. That's a 3rd reason. And a 4th reason is, in effect, a celebration of Jewish sovereignty in Yerushalayim. We're basically saying that we're back. We haven't been able to do this for 1900 years, and we've returned. So you can understand why those people who were at best ambivalent and perhaps even very much opposed to the Zionist enterprise are going to not want to participate in this. You see this very clearly in 1987. 1987, there is a mass hakel at the Kotel. I said in 1980 already it was celebrated at the Kotel, but on a more muted level. There is a huge celebration in 1987. In excess of 50,000 people are participating, and for the first time, the Nasi reads from the Torah. Even here, by the way, there was a bit of a machloket. Rav Herzog said you should make the bracha Birchot HaTorah on reading of the Torah. Rav Ovadia Yosef, who participated as Rabbi Rashi, felt that you shouldn't make a bracha on the Torah. He has a lengthy tshuva that was written in anticipation of the 1980 ceremony. In 1987, so the president at the time was Chaim Herzog, Rav Herzog's son. So he read from the Torah. He made a bracha, and the Rabbanim HaRashim at the time read after him. Rav Shapira read from the Torah. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu read from the Torah as well. You can look it up in various newspaper archives for description of this. And this already created a backlash. Because Chaim Herzog was not Shomer Torah Mitzvot, and because he was not Shomer Torah Mitzvot, so there was a backlash in the Haredi world saying that this is going against the very nature of what Hakel is supposed to be. It's even if you want to say that you could have some kind of zecher for Hakel, is this what you should be doing? What should you be having a person who is Mechalel Shabbat as being your melech and you're raising? And so we're here. I'm not going to read it because I'm already over time. Because of the late start, I apologize again. That the Rav Shach, for example, published a letter. This is source number 19, and in the letter you actually see. So he says that it's and the Haredi line went very strongly with it. Here is a public position against the Hakel celebration, and it's because the Nasi is not a person who is, in their opinion, someone that you should be focusing your attention on. The current chief rabbi, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, Rav Ovadia Yosef's son, in his Yalkut Yosef, written back in 1990, in the aftermath of this, so he also voices his critique of it. It'll be interesting to see what he does this coming Sukkot. Those of you who look at I looked at the website of the Kotel. The Hakel celebration is scheduled for Wednesday, the second day of Chol HaMoed, at 6:30 p.m. So what will happen is an open question, because every year it's different. In 1987, there was this, as I said, mass celebration. The backlash in in 1995, 1994, was such because of it, so that Ezer Weitzman, who was the president at the time, didn't come to the celebration, and it was the Rabbanim Harashiyim who read from the Torah in 2002. So the 2001. I'm getting my years ago. But in 2001, Moshe Katsav, who was the president, he was convicted for pretty bad crimes afterwards, but was Shomer Shabbat. So he read from the Torah and was greeted with trumpets at the Hakel celebration. 7 years later, in 2008, so there had been a backlash again, and that was when you see the politics that are involved. At that point, the chief rabbi was basically being sponsored by Rebbe Yashiv, the Haredi wing, and so there was no. They didn't even call it anymore the Hakel. They called it a Zecher LeMinhag Hakel, along those lines, and there was a breakaway ceremony that Machon HaMikdash sponsored. That was in 2008 and 2015. So again, there was a Hakel at the Kotel, and at that time, Ruby Rivlin, who was the president, so he did not read from the Torah. He read 2 prakim of Tehillim, and other people read from the Torah. So it's in flux. But what you see, so we'll see what happens in 2 weeks' time, Bezrat Hashem. But what you see is that there is a development, and I think an important development as we are getting to the point, Bezrat Hashem. As I said before, maybe already for the next Shemitah, who knows, that there will be a Jewish majority here, and there might be a din of Hakel, where the question of Dat and Medina is in flux, and the role of the integration of Charedim into the government is something which is new and has occurred, but would never have occurred 20 years ago. So all of these things, I think, are impacting on the way that a mitzvah deoraita, which fell out of disuse and has been reborn in the last 150 years or so, starting with the Aderet and through its various iterations through the history of the state. And we are living in a period, Be'ezrat Hashem, of Reshit Smichat Ge'ulatenu, and things that are tzomeach, develop and grow, and Hakel, which is a celebration of Sinai. So that's something which also is developing and growing before our very eyes. Yiratzon, that we'll all be zoche to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Hakel bimloa in bimheira b'yameinu after binyan hamikdash.
Quick question. There's this minhag on Hoshana Rabbah that many people do of reading all the Sefer Dvarim. In addition to the Leil Tikkun, but this did that start with the Aderet?
No, I don't think that started with the Aderet. I think that it preceded him. What I didn't have a chance to touch upon where I said Hakel fell into disuse, but there are different aspects of our, I guess you could call it our liturgy, which reflects Hakel, starting with Sefer Kohelet. And it's even called Kohelet. And there are those Rishonim, the Abarbanel, for example, says that the reason why Shlomo HaMelech was called Kohelet was because he was Mekayim Hakel. And the idea that this reading of Megillat Kohelet is in effect an echo of the Hakel. The Abarbanel says that, in his opinion, the mitzvah, the minhag of Simchat Torah, of finishing the Torah every year at Sukkot time, starts because of Hakel. He even wants to claim that in the time of the Mikdash, they would finish different Svarim every year of the Shemitah, and then they would finish everything at the Hakel. That was the idea. It wasn't that there was nothing the other 6 years, but it was a culmination. There are those who want to argue that the minhag of Kriyat Torah in Eretz Yisrael, which, as many of you know, was a 3.5-year cycle, but there were 2 parallel 3.5-year cycles. It's a little too complicated to get into the details right now, but there are those who want to argue that it was designed to be finished, really everything be finished at the 7 years. In other words, what we do, because our minhag is the Babylonian minhag of finishing the Torah every year, but the idea of finishing it in effect every 7 years, so that is, of course, Hakel as well. In other words, so there are a lot of different minhagim which have been introduced. If you want to, and this is the Lubavitcher Rebbe wanted to claim that the reason why we don't have Hakel is because, or a Zecher LaHakel, is because we found other ways of introducing the message of Hakel into our day-to-day life. Right? So if you have the Kriyat Torah that's doing it, and you have yeshivot that are teaching it, and you have different, and you're saying Megillat Kohelet, etc., so then you don't need a Zecher for the ceremony itself, because the purpose of the ceremony, it's the purpose that you want to get across. It's not the ceremony. So you want to get the idea across of teaching Torah and to inculcate Torah into the fabric of our daily lives. Wonderful. Here's another way of doing it. So when we have the mitzvah of Hakel, when the Mikdash is rebuilt, when Jews have returned to Eretz Yisrael fully, so then we'll have the mitzvah. But in the meantime, if you want a Zecher, so you can have the Zecher by having, in Chabad, they have different ceremonies, not a Hakel ceremony, but teaching Torah ceremonies in the 7th year. And that is that's where it stems from, that the Rebbe felt that was something which was very important in this regard. So the reading of Sefer Dvarim on Hoshana Rabbah is probably one of those minhagim as well that was introduced as part of the, if you will, in the larger sense, a Zecher of Hakel.
Gemar Chatima Tova. Thank you.
Gemar Chatima Tova. It was wonderful seeing you again. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I'm glad we were able to have the shir.
Thank you.